welcome Anya Foxen, who is a professor at Polytechnic State University in California. And she is also a research scholar, a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. And she will be presenting her paper titled Yoga to the People, haṃ-sa and Om Mantras in Paramahansa Yogananda's Yogoda and Kriya Yoga. Anya, welcome to the panel, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Brian, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen before I start talking because it will be easier that way. Okay, here we go. So thanks again. Thanks to the organizing teams and to all of you in the audience for logging on and participating in this. So today I'm going to talk about basically a modern version of what Seth just described, because this is a living practice, right? And it exists in these various lineages that are still practicing this particular flavor of Hatha Yoga today. But I also want to address the larger question of this panel, which is why do we chant mantras in yoga? And unless you're practicing with one of these lineages and you're doing a pretty traditional style of Hatha Yoga that's really focused on this sort of very specific manipulation of internal energies, you're probably chanting some of your mantras for slightly different reasons. Or maybe entirely different reasons. Or maybe when you hear mantra, you don't even think of seed syllables or things like soham and om. Maybe you think of individual words in your own language, like surrender or love or abundance. Or phrases like let go or something even more elaborate. This is the kind of thing that modern yoga teachers across the world talk about today when they tell you to set an intention, for instance, which happens at the beginning of many yoga classes. So here's what's interesting. Insofar as mantra, if you break down the Sanskrit, etymologically means something like instrument of the mind, these things absolutely qualify as mantras. But they work differently than the South Asian mantras we've been talking about so far, and they have a different history. So we'll touch on that as well in the course of my talk, because Yogananda is really bringing a lot of these things together. Now, the lineage that I want to talk about today does belong to Paramahansa Yogananda, whom you see here on the title slide. And if you're trying to figure out where you've seen him before, it's probably on the cover of this book. Autobiography of a Yogi first came out in 1946. It's been one of those spiritual classics that people sort of hand around for almost 80 years now. Steve Jobs famously used to give out a copy to anybody that showed up at his house, and it was handed out at his funeral. So it has this sort of very interesting cultural legacy. So Yogananda was born Mukundalal Ghosh in 1893. He was technically born in Uttar Pradesh, but his family was Bengali and he spent a lot of his childhood in Calcutta. As the story goes, Yogananda was first initiated into a practice called Kriya Yoga by his father when he was 13. Yogananda's father was a disciple of the same guru, a man named Lahiri Mahashaya, as Yogananda's own future guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar. So Yogananda had this early basis in the sadhana of Kriya Yoga, but his background was very multi-layered. So at this point, it's worth noting that, especially as a young man, he was quite interested in physical culture. In fact, Yogananda's younger brother, Vishnu Ghosh, was more or less responsible for developing, along with a couple of important collaborators, the style of yoga that Bikram Choudhury later popularized in the West. I bring this up now for a couple of reasons. One is that Yogananda is usually distanced from postural styles of yoga, which is historically just kind of inaccurate. In fact, we know that he taught asana to his advanced disciples in the US. And the other reason is that even though he didn't teach asana to everyone, this focus on the physical showed up in a different way in his public-facing teachings. At the end of the day, Yogananda was a popularizer. And so a lot of what he did was about making these very specialized, very difficult practices accessible to an American audience who often had no cultural context in which to understand them otherwise. But before we talk about all of that, let's talk a little bit about what Kriya Yoga actually is, because I think this would be useful. Yogananda's lineage traces their method back to an immortal enlightened being known only as Babaji. There he is on the display of the Self-Realization Fellowship's gurus. In 1861, rather, Babaji famously appeared to an initiated Lahiri Mahashaya, who was then a clerk for the military engineering department of the colonial British government. So there's Babaji, and there is Lahiri Mahashaya. Now, all the gurus in Yogananda's lineage ultimately trace their parampara through Lahiri Mahashaya. This includes Yogananda's own guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, who is right there. And as the story goes, having been lost in the Dark Ages, although Yogananda is very unclear on when exactly that is, the tradition maintains that this Kriya Yoga technique is nevertheless the same technique that Krishna taught to Arjuna, that was known to Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutra, and also that Jesus taught to his own disciples. And so, of course, you see Jesus and Krishna both at the center of the altar there. Now, all of this may be, but historically speaking, Kriya Yoga follows the basic format of what Jim Mallinson has called classical Hatha Yoga, this kind of fusion of ascetic and tantric techniques that first makes its appearance in texts around the 13th century of the Common Era. Now, Yogananda's lineage does not actually claim any of these medieval texts as their own, nor do they tend to refer to this literature, unlike some roughly contemporary modernizers of postural yoga, for example, who are very fond of citing all sorts of medieval texts. Kriya Yoga is generally passed down through initiation from guru to disciple. And while there are written records of the practice's basic elements, they really do vary from one report to another. And there's all sorts of stories about how Lahiri Mahashaya systematized it in this particular way. And there's this number of kriyas, but then at the end of the day, everybody breaks them down a little bit differently. And the order sometimes varies. The details get a little bit messy, such as the reality of the living tradition, right? Generally, though, the lineage does agree on these four basic stages to the practice. And so I'd like to sort of briefly review these. So you'll notice there's 4 units here, but one of them is sort of a lot more explicated than the others. And this is because some of these techniques are preparatory. And so this is actually what we'll see in Yogananda's own method in a second. So there is the first Kriya, as it's known, that has these sort of subsidiary parts, which generally tend to consist of what's called the Mahamudra, the Great Seal, which is basically pranayama coupled with something that looks very much like Paschimottanasana, this kind of a forward fold. There's the Nabhi Mudra, which is the navel seal, where it's a hand seal that's applied to the navel chakra in a few different positions. And at this point, the Om syllable is chanted. Then comes the Talavya Kriya, the palatal exercise, where you basically stretch the frenulum. This is kind of a preparatory technique for ultimately performing Kechari Mudra, which is where the tongue is inserted into the nasal cavity. And then comes what's called Kriya proper, which is basically pranayama performed with a seed mantra. It's kind of unspecified at this point. This is usually accompanied by or succeeded by what's usually called the Yoni Mudra in the larger tradition, the sort of source seal, if we want to translate it very generically. Yogananda famously calls this the Jyoti Mudra, partially because I think he didn't really want to explain the complexities of the term yoni to a 1920s American audience. And so this basically looks very much like what we saw Chris talk about as the Shamukhi Mudra, which is basically where you cover with your fingers the various orifices of the face, especially the eyes and the ears. Now, this is all, again, sort of preparatory, right? Like you have to be able to do all this stuff in order to progress. After this come 3 stages that are essentially permutations of each other. First, there's the Omkara Kriya, which is the Om making exercise. This is really a multi-level practice, and this is where the practitioner can expect to remain for a prolonged period of time. That evolves as kind of imposition of mantras and visualizing the chakras or the various energy centers. Now, usually at this point, the only mantra used, as I've seen, is Om. So this is a little bit different from earlier on in the practice where you might have been using different seed mantras, hence it's called the Om making exercise. This is coupled with pranayama, and there's this particular sort of what they call the pecking technique, where basically you kind of move your head back and forth. And it's meant to sort of train the practitioner to manipulate energy in this very specific way. Then comes the Brahmayoni Mudra, which is similar to what we just learned in the Omkara Kriyas. But the goal at this point is to fully establish this Om sound, this Pranava sound, in what's known as the Brahmayoni, the third eye. And then once this has been accomplished comes sort of the real thing, right? What's called the Purna Kriya, which basically relies on these same techniques that the practitioner has just been developing. But at this point, the mantra practice is no longer explicit. It's entirely internalized. The pranava sound now arises naturally, resonates naturally within the body. And at this point, pranayama and visualization techniques are used to raise kundalini, which is the sort of ultimate goal of this practice. So what's interesting is that this is obviously located in a very specific tradition of what the ultimate goal of yoga looks like. It does rely on this kind of kundalini raising. If you look at Yogananda, especially the kind of philosophical underpinnings of his system, there's very interesting Kaula undertones there. It seems to be leaning towards the Shakta side of things, but this is not generally articulated, even when Kriya Yoga is discussed today. And certainly it doesn't make it into the public-facing side of Yogananda's teaching. But in any case, this framework is more or less what you would still learn today if you received initiation into Yogananda's organization, the Self-Realization Fellowship. However, when Yogananda first arrived in the US in 1920, this is not exactly what he taught. Kriya Yoga has always been reserved for disciples who had proven their seriousness in various ways, had gone through all the necessary preparatory steps, which were eventually formalized into this mail order course, which is still available today. And at this point, the practitioner, once they had completed all these steps, would have been considered ready for initiation, but only then. Yogananda, however, also had a public-facing set of techniques that were freely available and which required no further commitment. Forget about initiation, right? You could just pick these up in a pamphlet, essentially. Eventually, these became known as the energization practices, and they are also still practiced by initiates today, before and after their entry into the formal Kriya Yoga as a sort of, again, preparatory technique. But they started out as a system called Yogoda, which was published and distributed in pamphlet form as a sort of basic at-home manual for what we can call maybe psychophysical wellness. And wellness in our modern sense of the word, right? I think that's exactly appropriate here. Yogoda addressed daily concerns of American householders who made up Yogananda's audience. Diet, stress, minor illness, even weight loss or muscle gain, depending on what you were aiming for. And in this system, we can see Yogananda's familiarity with physical culture, including Western systems that were made popular through contemporary exercise manuals that he would have had access to. But I want to bring our attention, looking at the system that's described in Yogoda. Oops. Actually, sorry, let's go to this slide first. I want to bring our attention to this preparatory affirmation, as he calls it. Now, this is an elaborate form of the other type of mantra that we find in modern yoga today. You'll notice this is not about seed syllables. This is not about Om. There's no Sanskrit here. In fact, it's very sort of semantically based, right? It kind of matters what the words and phrases here are. Most directly, this practice derives from the New Thought movement, which kind of sits at the nexus of Western esoteric spirituality and proto-psychology. As one New Thought guru named Norman Vincent Peale once said, change your thoughts and you change your world. And so new thought affirmations like this one were geared at doing just that. They were basically statements meant to sort of reprogram the mind's habitual patterns. Sometimes this was towards higher consciousness, but sometimes it was towards obtaining some practical goal or even object. Um, Here we see something that's a little bit more sort of higher consciousness, spirituality oriented. But Yogananda actually had an entire book of these, which could be chanted during the various types of exercises. And some of them were meant to connect you to the cosmic vibration by fine-tuning your spiritual mindset. But some were also meant to connect you to material success, as he calls it, for instance. They involved repeating phrases like, I have everything, I have everything, I am wealthy, I am rich. Um, and I talk about new thought in the past tense, but this stuff is very much still with us. Whenever you hear somebody talk about manifesting, this is basically where they're coming from. But it also shows up in a more subtle form in this intention setting practice that we often see in modern yoga classes. So we can return to this alternative model of mantra in the Q&A if it feels useful. But for now, I want to shift focus to the place where all of this comes together in Yogananda's work. Now, I already mentioned that Yogananda was a popularizer who aimed to make these very difficult and esoteric practices accessible to an audience that's grounded in different culture. And so let's actually go back to this slide for a second. He did this through the Yogoda system by substituting, for instance, asanas with European style muscle tension and gymnastic exercises. So we see an example of this on the page here, where you have this sort of like leg rotating thing that the practitioner is supposed to be doing. He also did this by incorporating affirmations, as we just saw. And in addition to this, he built in an adapted version of the basic Kriya Yoga practice as the culmination of this Yogoda method. And so we see this in the use of the two traditional mantras, the haṃ-sa and the om, into what Yogananda calls the highest techniques of concentration that make up the final two lessons of the Yogoda course. So the haṃ-sa technique, which you can see a little bit of the Bengali pronunciation there and the way that he anglicizes the mantra. So the haṃ-sa technique uses something like a basic mudra to draw attention to the breath. You can see in the instructions, he's basically using something like a jnana mudra, tapping the thumb and index finger together with the rhythm of the breath as you mentally chant haṃ-sa. So this is effectively meant to turn the flow of the breath itself into a kind of mantra. And you will notice that Yogananda assigns a basic meaning to the phrase. At the end of the highlighted section there, he says, haṃ-sa means soul, or sorry, haṃ means soul, and sa means the great spirit. But it's not really the semantic meaning of the mantra that matters, which is very different from what he was doing with the affirmations. So from the haṃ-sa technique, this comes first, right? This is lesson number 4 coming at the end of this pamphlet that's mostly comprised of, again, these kind of physical muscle tension exercises. So from the haṃ-sa technique, the practitioner then progresses to the om technique. And this is really interesting because in the preparatory section here, so the first highlighted bit, you can sort of you can actually see that Yogananda is describing a simplified form of yoni mudra, where you sort of place your fingers over the eyes and the ears. And then he describes this kind of intuitive chakra visualization practice where he talks about coming to know rather the astral or the electric body with its various shapes and hues. You'll notice too that there's a list of sounds here that I think is very similar to what Chris pointed out before. But there's no instruction really of any kind of intentional visualization here. It's all very kind of intuitive and natural. And then finally, there's the mental chanting of the Om mantra until the symphony of the rolling Om, as he calls it, comes to fill the body. Now, notice that in both exercises, there's no actual chanting going on. In the Om technique, especially, Yogananda is very firm that nothing in the physical body should move. You're not speaking the mantra. It's entirely internal. So you can see how these might be useful introductory exercises for people who would later seek initiation into Kriya Yoga. This system doesn't have any of the kind of haṭha yogic bells and whistles that the first Kriya has. It's pretty unsystematic when it comes to training awareness of the subtle body or hearing the pranava sound, but it gives you a basic taste of what these things are like. And so if and when you actually were taught the full technique, you're no longer starting from scratch, is kind of the idea. On the other hand, let's consider the fact that most people who went to Yogananda's lectures, where he might have taught some of these techniques, or who picked up the pamphlet, did not actually become Kriya Yoga initiates. So what does this look like for Yogoda to function as a self-contained system? Well, in that sense, it's very much meant to mimic the kind of logic that you would have found in contemporary Western systems of psycho-spiritual wellness. It's meant to train the body, but also the 2 concentration exercises are meant to put you in tune with the infinite, as New Thought author Ralph Waldo Trine put it in the title of one of his books. And then there are the affirmations, those other mantras, which are not only voiced, but contain specific semantic content, all of which is basically targeted at helping you be kind of all that you can be. So I would argue that we can still find most of these tendencies in yoga classes today. I'd add that the way that we do breath work in popular Western versions of yoga is also not entirely grounded in South Asian traditions of pranayama. You may have noticed Yogananda only instructs natural breath. There's a bit of pairing the breath with movement and the energization exercises, all of this, including the term energization exercise itself, he probably got from contemporary American teachers, like, for instance, a woman named Genevieve Stebbins. But there are no advanced pranayama techniques here. There's no kumbhaka, although certainly all of that exists in Kriya Yoga. But you do have this focus on the flow of the breath as the mantra in and of itself. And above all, you have a focus on yoga as a popular practice. This is Yogananda teaching yoga to the people. So I'll leave you with this poem from Yogananda's Songs of the Soul book that he recommends that you read and or chant at the completion of the Om exercise. And thank you for listening.